Hi, this is Don Pascal, and this is the first video of a new series called 5 Gate 2, has 5 doors to or 5 accesses to music genre. We thought that many people need some help to get the right introduction to a musical genre they are not necessarily familiar with, and this is all the purpose of these videos. Before we start, if you want to help us and have this concept taking off, you can please like, subscribe or share the video with your friends on socials. You will find below the video all the links of the albums, the music we are talking about, the different platforms, musical platforms, sometimes the links to relevant, interesting articles about the records we are talking about. Also, before we start, I would like to stress the fact that some music is not as obvious as some pop music can be or some rap music can be. For some kinds of music or some albums in musical genres, you have to give it a little bit of time. You have to produce an effort to try to understand, be curious, and listen 2-3 times before you really start to understand the depth and the meaning and the significance of the music you're listening to. I can take an example. When I was a teenager, about 14, and I was listening to rock music at the time, and I discovered Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix. I heard that was a major record. And when I listened to it the first time, I was totally unsettled. I could understand that something important was happening. I could understand it was something like really serious, but the format, the structure of the songs, everything was so different than what I was used to, that it took me 2-3 listenings before getting really into the record. Ideally, the best way to discover great music is on vinyl, but I understand that not everybody can have a turntable, so even on digital, we will introduce the music in the album format. Why? Because that's been the format of creation of artists for decades, and it has a coherence to it, and we believe that's the best way to discover most of the time the piece of work, a major piece of work of an artist. So the first album of our selection is A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. Absolute masterpiece.
Recorded over 2 days in December 1964, it is one of the major albums of the legendary quartet comprised of John Coltrane, Elvin Jones, McCoy Tyner, and Jimmy Garrison. It's a masterpiece of jazz, of spiritual jazz, and of modal jazz. The album has been featured in so many lists of the best albums of all times, and it has influenced many artists like Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin. The structure of the album is a suite in 4 parts: acknowledgement, which includes the oral chant that gives the album its name, resolution, pursuance, and psalm. Coltrane presented the Love Supreme as a spiritual declaration, that his musical devotion was now intertwined with his faith in God. In many ways, the album mirrors Coltrane's spiritual quest that grew up of his personal troubles, including a long struggle with drug and alcohol addiction. Following this record, Coltrane became a cult musician in many parts of the world, including Japan, where he went for a 16-date tour in the summer of 1966, just before his death in 1967, less than 3 years after recording this album.
Second album from our selection today, Journey in Satchidananda by Alice Coltrane. Alice Coltrane was the wife of John Coltrane from a second marriage. She met him in Detroit, and she recorded this album in November 1970, just before a trip to India, about 3 years after the death of John Coltrane.
So a little bit of background regarding Alice Coltrane. She performed classical piano at concerts around Detroit in her teens. In 1960, at 23, she moved to Paris and took up jazz under the mentorship of pianist Bud Powell. By the following year, she was performing as the intermission pianist at the Blue Note in Paris. Later on, she was a sought-after improviser, notable for her commitment to trance-like playing. While playing a New York show with Terry Gibbs' band in 1962, she met John Coltrane on a shared bill at Metropole. The following year, she left Gibbs' band to marry John, with whom she had 3 children. John died of liver cancer in 1967, 5 years after their encounter. It was a tremendous shock for Alice. She couldn't sleep and she saw visions, she lost weight. In the depth of her grief, Alice had visited a man named Swami Satchidananda, a guru who had spoken to the crowds at Woodstock, and she became his disciple. His advice and spiritual guidance soothed her spirit, hence the name of this album. Journey in Satchidananda is the 4th solo album by Alice Coltrane. 4 of the album tracks were recorded at the Coltrane home studio in Dix Hills, New York, including the track Something About John Coltrane in D minor mode, so beautifully faithful to the John Coltrane musical universe. It's a cornerstone album, essential for anyone interested in the development of modal and experimental jazz, but it's also remarkably accessible. The musicians on the album are Pharoah Sanders, who's going to be the object of our next selection, Cecil McBee and Charlie Haddon on bass, and Rashid Ali on drums. And here we will quote the beautiful lines of Josephine Livingston in Pitchfork. Journey in Satchidananda pays full tribute to the transformation that Alice Coltrane underwent in the late 60s as a human being and artist. This is a record as much about the soul as it is about skilled orchestration. As the title of the album tells us, it's a journey. Coltrane takes us across uncharted territory in jazz composition, drawing from multiple cultures and diverse instruments, but she also shows us emotion in motion. Because she refuses to stay in one key, instead treating the album's theme as a set of recurring melodic shapes, the very texture of Journey is defined by transition, process, and flow. Its music has no beginning or end. Instead, as the first bars of the opening track demonstrate, Coltrane is working with the principle of looping and transcendence. Every top melody is an exploration, but Coltrane's orchestration always provides a stable and repetitive place of return.
Third album of the selection, Thembi by Pharoah Sanders. Absolute masterpiece of spiritual jazz. Pharoah Sanders was a musician on the Journey Satchidananda album by Alice Coltrane that we just introduced. And he recorded this album in the winter of 70-71, just after the recording of the Alice Coltrane album.
It has the same compelling spirituality that inhabits Coltrane's masterpiece. As a matter of fact, Pharoah Sanders became, through the following decades, the main disciple and keeper of the flame of John Coltrane's spiritual jazz, while building an original piece of work certainly more Afrocentric than Coltrane's work. Pharoah Sanders died very recently in 2022, after decades of dedication to his highly spiritual search in music, releasing on the way a multitude of albums with many masterpieces among them. To quote Andy Betta in Red Bull Music Academy, the sustained brilliance of Sanders' Impulse years, Impulse being the name of the label he recorded so many albums, has been matched by few ensembles in jazz history. For strength, beauty, and startling vision, Sanders' music remains a spiritual high point in American music, touching all who encountered it. We will start playing and something happened to the entire room, Norman Connors said of his time with Pharoah. I can't really describe it. It's just such a beautiful thing. It was almost as if everybody was going to heaven. There is also an interesting anecdote about this album. It was the first time Lonnie Liston Smith played the Rhodes. To quote the keyboardist himself, on Thembi, that was the first time that I ever touched a Fender Rhodes electric piano. We got to the studio in California, Cecil McBee had to unpack his bass, the drummer had to set up his drums, Pharoah had to unpack all his horns. Everybody had something to do. But the piano was just sitting there waiting. I saw the instruments sitting in the corner and I asked the engineer, "What is that?" He said, "That's a Fender Rhodes electric piano." I didn't have anything to do, so I started messing with it, checking some of the buttons to see what I could do with different sounds. All of a sudden, I started writing a song and everybody ran over and said, "What is that?" And I said, "I don't know, I'm just messing around." Pharoah said, "Man, we gotta record that. What you gonna call it?" I'd been studying astral projections and it sounded like we were floating through space. So I said, "Let's call it astral traveling." That's how I got introduced to the electric piano. The musicians on this album are Lonnie Liston-Smith on piano and percussions, Michael White on violin, Cecil McBee on bass, and Roy Haynes on drums. Many of the players that Sanders brought into his band will become stars in their own right. Lonnie Liston-Smith, Leon Thomas, Norman Connors, Gary Bartz, Stanley Clarke, Idris Muhammad, James M. Tume, and more. His music remains a beacon. As Smith described the music he made with Pharoah, we were trying to enlighten the world through music because music is a universal language.
Fourth album of our selection today, Spirits Known and Unknown by Leon Thomas, one of my very favorite artists, often called the John Coltrane of jazz vocalists. This record was recorded in October 1969. It features Lonnie Liston-Smith on keyboards, who was also on the recording sessions of the Pharoah Sanders album we introduced previously, and the Alice Coltrane album we also introduced previously.
The other musicians on the album are Cecil McBee on bass and Roy Haynes on drums. Leon Thomas played with Art Blakey, Count Basie, Randy Weston, Roland Kirk, Orchie Shepp, and Oliver Nelson before linking up with Pharoah Sanders for a partnership that continues to entrance listeners today. Leon recorded on two of Pharoah's most renowned classics, Karma in 1969 and Jewels of Thoughts in 1970. And his vocals on the cuts The Creator as a Master Plan and Whom Allah have entered into legend. He resumed his relationship with Pharoah Sanders and cut superb tracks with him on the albums Shukuru in 1983 and Oh Lord, Let Me Do No Wrong in 1987. He also sang on two albums of Carlos Santana, Lotus and Welcome. He was very focused in expanding the voice possibilities in new forms of music, exactly like John Coltrane did for the saxophone. He was inspired by the most ancient forms of musical expression like African pygmies and other things in Africa, Indian ragas, music of the Himalayas, and so on. He contended that to be really into what is modern, you have to simultaneously go as far back as you can. In the 60s, horns had been at the forefront in terms of exploring the new dimensions of sound and expression, and Leon Thomas was maybe the greatest vocalist in terms of doing the same thing with the voice, as well as bringing a spiritual and therapeutic unique contribution in the vocal jazz.
And finally, the last album of our selection today is Promises by Floating Point and Pharoah Sanders. Floating Point is a very important producer of the London electronic music scene for many years. On this album, he composed the music, played different instruments, and enlisted the London Symphony Orchestra to perform over it.
The result is a sweeping 9-movement piece called Promises. Although Pharoah Sanders was in his last year, the 7-notes refrain played on a harpsichord by Sam Shepard provides the perfect universe for the saxophonist to express his highly spiritual game. The combination of the gorgeous arrangements of Sam Shepard and the spiritual density of the horn of Pharoah give birth to what is certainly the major work of spiritual jazz in the last decade.